The summer of 1864 arrived in Bath, with unusual heat that seemed to press down upon the elegant Georgian terraces like a physical weight. Inside Thornfield House, the grandest residence on Royal Crescent, the air hung thick and still, despite the servants' best efforts to create cross breezes through the stately rooms. But the oppressive atmosphere had less to do with the weather than with the secret that had poisoned the very foundations of the household for 2 decades. Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood stood at the window of the servants' parlour, her reflection ghostly in the wavy glass. At 53 years old, she was the longest-serving member of Thornfield's household staff, having arrived as a frightened 14-year-old scullery maid in 1825. Now, as head housekeeper, she commanded the respect of every servant in the great house. Known for her impeccable standards, her fair treatment of those under her supervision, and her absolute discretion regarding the family's private affairs. But discretion, Eleanor had learned over 40 years of service, could become its own form of prison. And the secret she had kept locked inside her heart for 20 years had grown so heavy that she sometimes wondered if it might crush her entirely. The Earl of Ashford, the current Earl, that is, young Lord William, had just announced his engagement to Lady Constance Fairfax, and the household was buzzing with preparations for the elaborate celebration that would introduce Bath society to the future Countess. Eleanor should have been pleased. Lord William was a good man, nothing like his father had been. He treated the servants with genuine kindness and managed the estate with fairness and integrity. Yet every time Eleanor looked at him, she saw the ghost of the previous Earl, Lord Thomas Ashford, who had died suddenly in the summer of 1844 at the age of 47. The official cause of death had been recorded as heart failure, a tragic but not uncommon occurrence in a man of his age and habits. He had been buried with all the pomp and ceremony befitting his station, mourned publicly by a wife who wore black for the prescribed period, and succeeded by his eldest son, who had been only 19 at the time. 20 years had passed, and the true circumstances of Lord Thomas's death remained known to only 2 people, Eleanor herself, and the woman who had actually administered the poison that ended his life. That woman was Mary Winters, who had been Thornfield's head parlour maid back in 1844, a beautiful, vivacious young woman of 23 with auburn hair and green eyes that sparkled with intelligence and life. Mary had been Eleanor's protégée, almost like a daughter to the housekeeper, who had never married or had children of her own. Eleanor had taught Mary everything she knew about managing a great household, had encouraged her natural talents, and had watched with pride as the girl rose from lowly housemaid to a position of relative authority. And then Lord Thomas had noticed her. Even now, 20 years later, Eleanor could remember the exact moment she had realized what was happening. She had entered the morning room to discuss the week's menus with Lady Ashford, and had found Lord Thomas alone with Mary, his hand on her arm in a manner that no gentleman should touch a servant. The look of fear in Mary's eyes, the predatory satisfaction in Lord Thomas's expression. Eleanor had understood immediately what was beginning. What followed were 6 months of mounting horror as Eleanor watched the situation deteriorate. Lord Thomas was not a man accustomed to being denied anything he desired, and he had decided that he desired Mary Winters. He began finding excuses to summon her to his study, to speak with her alone in empty corridors, to intercept her when she moved through the house on her duties. Mary, terrified of losing her position and knowing she had no power to refuse an earl's demands, had tried desperately to avoid him. She began taking the servants' passages exclusively, asked other maids to deliver items to rooms where Lord Thomas might be, and even requested a transfer to the London house, a request that Lord Thomas personally denied. Eleanor had tried to protect her. She had assigned Mary duties that kept her away from the family's private quarters, had personally delivered items to Lord Thomas rather than sending Mary, and had even attempted to broach the subject with Lady Ashford. But the Countess, a cold woman who seemed more interested in her social position than in the welfare of her household staff, had made it clear that she did not wish to hear about her husband's indiscretions. Men have their needs. "Mrs. Blackwood," Lady Ashford had said dismissively. The girl should consider herself fortunate to have attracted his attention. Many would envy her position. The callousness of that response had filled Eleanor with impotent rage. She had seen this pattern before in other great houses. Powerful men preying upon vulnerable servants, secure in the knowledge that society would protect them and blame their victims. But seeing it happen to Mary, whom she loved like a daughter, was unbearable. The crisis had come on a warm June evening in 1844. Eleanor would never forget the image of Mary stumbling into the housekeeper's parlour, her dress torn, her face bruised, and her eyes completely empty of their usual light. She had collapsed into Eleanor's arms and sobbed for hours, unable to speak about what Lord Thomas had done to her in the privacy of his study, while the rest of the household went about their evening duties. Eleanor had held her through that terrible night, rage and grief warring in her own heart. She had wanted to go immediately to the authorities, to expose Lord Thomas for the monster he was. But Mary had begged her not to. They both knew that no constable would take the word of a servant over an earl, that Mary would be dismissed without references and likely driven to destitution or worse. "I want him to pay," Mary had whispered in the grey light of dawn, her voice hoarse from crying. "I want him to suffer as he's made me suffer. But no one will believe me. No one will help me." Eleanor had promised to find a way to protect her, though she had no idea how she could possibly keep that promise. 3 days later, Lord Thomas had collapsed at the dinner table, clutching his chest and gasping for air. The family physician, Dr. Harrison, had been summoned immediately, but there was nothing he could do. Within an hour, the Earl of Ashford was dead, and the household had been thrown into chaos. The official cause of death was heart failure, attributed to Lord Thomas's fondness for rich food and port wine. No one questioned it. Why would they? He had been overweight and sedentary, exactly the type of man who might suffer sudden cardiac arrest. Only Eleanor had noticed the small brown bottle that appeared on Mary's shelf in the servants' quarters the day before Lord Thomas died. Only Eleanor had seen Mary slip into the dining room before dinner service to adjust the place settings, and only Eleanor had put together the pieces and understood what Mary had done. When she confronted Mary that night, the young woman hadn't bothered to deny it. "I got it from a chemist in Bristol," Mary had said quietly, her voice devoid of emotion. "I told him I needed it for rats. Foxglove extract, enough to stop a man's heart if administered in the right dose. I put it in his wine during dinner preparation. It was quick and relatively painless, which is more mercy than he showed me." Eleanor should have been horrified. She should have reported Mary to the authorities immediately. But instead, she had found herself helping the younger woman pack her belongings in the dead of night and arranging for her to take a coach to London, where she could disappear into the vast anonymity of the capital city. "Go far away," Eleanor had told her, pressing her life savings into Mary's trembling hands. "Change your name, start over, and never speak of this to anyone. What's done cannot be undone, but you have your whole life ahead of you. Don't let him destroy that too." Mary had left before dawn, and Eleanor had never seen or heard from her again. For 20 years, Eleanor had carried the weight of that knowledge alone. She had watched young Lord William grow into his father's title, praying that he would be nothing like the man who had raised him. She had served the household with unwavering dedication, pouring all her grief and guilt into maintaining the standards and order of Thornfield House. But now, as preparations began for Lord William's wedding, Eleanor felt the burden of her secret becoming unbearable. Lord William deserved to know the truth about his father before he started his own family. The household deserved to understand why their beloved head parlour maid had disappeared so suddenly. And Mary, wherever she was now, deserved to have her story heard, even if it came 20 years too late. Eleanor moved to her writing desk and pulled out a sheet of paper with trembling hands. She had made her decision. She would write down everything, the full, terrible truth about what had happened in the summer of 1844. She would present it to Lord William and let him decide what should be done. The consequences would be severe, she knew. She might face charges for helping Mary escape, for concealing a murder for 2 decades. The scandal would rock Bath society and tarnish the Ashford name. But the alternative, carrying this secret to her grave, had become impossible to contemplate. As her pen touched the paper, and she began to write the words she had kept silent for 20 years, Eleanor felt something unexpected, relief. Whatever came next, at least the truth would finally be free. 3 days later, Eleanor stood outside Lord William's private study with the sealed letter clutched in her hands. Her heart hammered against her ribs with such force that she felt light-headed, but her resolve remained firm. 20 years of silence had been 20 years too long. She knocked softly on the heavy oak door. "Come in," called Lord William's pleasant voice, and Eleanor entered to find the young earl seated at his desk, reviewing what appeared to be estate accounts. He looked up with a warm smile that made him appear younger than his 39 years. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said, setting aside his papers. "How good to see you. I trust the arrangements for the engagement celebration are proceeding smoothly." "Yes, my lord," Eleanor replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "Everything is well in hand. But I've come on a different matter, one that cannot wait any longer." Something in her tone made Lord William's expression shift to concern. He gestured to a chair across from his desk. "Please sit down. You look quite pale. Shall I ring for tea?" "No tea, thank you, my lord." Eleanor lowered herself into the chair and placed the letter on his desk. "I've written you a letter that contains information about events that occurred in this house 20 years ago. Information that I should have shared long ago but lacked the courage to reveal." Lord William picked up the letter, his brow furrowing with confusion and growing apprehension. "Mrs. Blackwood, you're frightening me. What could possibly have happened 20 years ago that—" He stopped suddenly, his face going pale. 20 years ago? That would be 1844, the year my father died. "Yes, my lord." Eleanor's hands twisted in her lap, but she met his gaze directly. "I'm asking you to read what I've written before you respond. It's a long story and a terrible one, but you deserve to know the full truth about your father's death." With shaking hands, Lord William broke the seal and began to read. Eleanor watched his face as his eyes moved across the pages, watched shock give way to disbelief, then to horror, and finally to something that looked like grief, mixed with a terrible understanding. When he finally looked up, his voice was hoarse. "My God, are you saying that my father was— that he forced himself upon Mary Winters, and that she poisoned him in revenge?" "Yes, my lord." Eleanor's own eyes filled with tears. "I know how monstrous it sounds, but every word is true. Mary was a good girl, from a decent family, who came to work here with hopes of making an honest living. Your father destroyed her, and when she realized that no one would help her or hold him accountable, she took justice into her own hands." Lord William rose from his chair and moved to the window, staring out at the elegant gardens without really seeing them. When he spoke again, his voice was thick with emotion. "I was 19 when he died. I thought he was a good man, stern perhaps and demanding, but I never suspected—" He trailed off, unable to complete the thought. "He was very careful to present a certain face to you and the public," Eleanor said gently. "But those of us who served in this household knew a different side of him. Your father believed that his position entitled him to anything and anyone he desired, regardless of the consequences to others. And Mary, what happened to her after my father died? I helped her escape to London with enough money to start over. I gave her my savings and told her to change her name and never speak of what happened. I don't know where she went or what became of her. I've never heard from her again." Lord William turned back to face Eleanor, and she was struck by the anguish in his eyes. "You protected a murderer," he said, though his tone held more sorrow than accusation. "You could have faced charges yourself for helping her escape." "Yes, my lord." I've known that for 20 years, and I've made my peace with it. Mary was a victim long before she became a perpetrator. What your father did to her was evil, and the fact that society would have protected him and condemned her was an even greater evil. I helped her because it was the only justice available to her. But murder, I know. Eleanor's voice was firm despite her trembling. I'm not saying what Mary did was right. Taking a life is never right, regardless of the provocation. But I'm asking you to understand the impossible position she was in, and the failure of everyone around her, including myself, to protect her from your father's predations. Lord William returned to his chair and sat heavily, the letter still clutched in his hand. Why are you telling me this now? After 20 years of silence, why confess? Because you're about to marry Lady Constance and start your own family, Eleanor replied. Because this house has been built on a foundation of lies and secrets for too long. And because I'm an old woman who won't live forever. And I couldn't bear to take this secret to my grave, knowing that you deserve to understand the truth about your father and the true circumstances of his death. What do you expect me to do with this information? Lord William asked, his voice heavy with the weight of the decision now thrust upon him. Report you to the authorities? Pursue Mary Winters for murder? Expose my father's crimes and destroy the family's reputation? I expect nothing, my lord, Eleanor said quietly. I'm placing this burden in your hands because it's rightfully yours to bear. You're the Earl of Ashford now, and you have the power to decide how this truth should be handled. Whatever you choose, I'll accept without protest. For a long moment, Lord William sat in silence, staring at the letter as if it might somehow provide answers to impossible questions. Finally, he looked up at Eleanor with an expression of profound sadness. Tell me about Mary, he said softly. Not about what happened at the end, but about who she was before. What kind of person was she? Eleanor felt tears spill down her cheeks as she remembered. She was wonderful, my lord. Bright and kind, with a quick laugh and a generous heart. She used to save part of her wages to send home to her widowed mother in Somerset. She loved to read. I used to lend her books from my own small collection, and she would discuss them with such intelligence and passion. She sang while she worked, and the other servants adored her because she was always willing to help with difficult tasks. She sounds remarkable. She was. Your father saw that spark in her and couldn't resist trying to possess it. And when he had taken everything from her, she saw only one way to prevent him from doing the same to others. Lord William rose and moved to a small cabinet, returning with 2 glasses of brandy. He handed one to Eleanor, a gesture that would have been shocking under normal circumstances, an earl serving his housekeeper. But these were not normal circumstances. To Mary Winters, he said quietly, raising his glass. May she have found the peace and happiness that was denied to her here. Eleanor raised her own glass, tears streaming freely down her face now. They drank in silence, and then Lord William spoke again, his voice carrying a determination that reminded Eleanor of the best qualities she had seen in his late mother. Here is what I've decided, he said. The official record will not be changed. My father died of heart failure, and that will remain the public account. But I want you to help me find Mary Winters, not to prosecute her or expose her, but to ensure that she's been cared for these past 20 years. If she's in need, I want to provide for her anonymously. And if she's built a good life for herself, I want to know that she found some measure of happiness after the terrible thing that happened to her here. Eleanor stared at him in amazement. My lord, you're being extraordinarily merciful. I'm being just, he corrected gently. My father committed a terrible crime, and Mary responded with another terrible crime. But 2 decades have passed, and vengeance serves no purpose now. What serves a purpose is acknowledging the truth, making what amends are possible, and ensuring that such things never happen in this household again. He stood and moved to his desk, pulling out a sheet of paper and beginning to write. I'm going to establish new policies for Thornfield House, he explained. Clear procedures for any servant who feels threatened or unsafe, with the authority to come directly to me without fear of dismissal. I'm going to ensure that every person who works in this house knows that their dignity and safety are paramount, regardless of their station. And I'm going to hire investigators to find Mary Winters and confirm her welfare. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel. We're working toward 1,000 subscribers, and when we reach that milestone, we'll have an incredible surprise waiting for all our loyal viewers. Trust us, you won't want to miss what we have planned. 6 weeks after Eleanor's confession, a letter arrived at Thornfield House bearing a London postmark. Lord William summoned Eleanor to his study immediately, his face alight with excitement as he held up the envelope. "The investigators have found her," he said without preamble. "Mary Winters, though she goes by another name now. She's alive and well, you need to read this for yourself." With trembling hands, Eleanor took the letter and began to read the investigator's report. As her eyes moved down the page, she felt emotions cascade through her in waves: relief, joy, pride, and a bittersweet sorrow for all the years that had been lost. Mary Winters, now known as Mrs. Margaret Thornton, had indeed made her way to London 20 years ago. She had used Eleanor's money to secure modest lodgings and had eventually found work as a companion to an elderly widow. When that woman died, she had left Mary a small inheritance in gratitude for her devoted care. Mary had used that money to establish a refuge house for women escaping difficult circumstances, a safe haven where servants fleeing abusive employers, wives escaping violent husbands, and young women with nowhere else to turn could find shelter, support, and practical assistance in rebuilding their lives over 20 years. Mary's refuge had helped hundreds of women. She had expanded from one small house to 3 separate facilities across London, funded by donations from wealthy benefactors who supported her mission. She had never married, instead dedicating her life to ensuring that other women didn't suffer as she had suffered. "She's been doing this for 20 years, Eleanor whispered, tears streaming down her face. "All this time, while I worried about what had become of her." "She's been saving other women," Lord William nodded, his own eyes bright with emotion. The investigator spoke with several women who had been helped by her refuge. They described Mrs. Thornton as stern but compassionate, demanding hard work but offering genuine care. One woman said that Mrs. Thornton had saved her life after she fled an employer who had done to her what my father did to Mary. The parallel was not lost on either of them. Mary had transformed her suffering into purpose, using her own terrible experience to protect others from similar fates. "There's more," Lord William said, pulling out another document. The investigator included information about the refuge's current financial situation. Despite its success in helping women, it's constantly struggling for funding. The operating costs exceed the donations they receive, and Mrs. Thornton has been using her personal resources to make up the difference. He looked at Eleanor with an expression of firm resolve. "I want to establish a trust fund for the refuge, enough to ensure its operations are fully funded in perpetuity. And I want to do it anonymously, through intermediaries, so that Mary never knows the money came from the Ashford family." "My lord, that's extraordinarily generous." "It's the least I can do," Lord William interrupted. "My father took everything from Mary Winters and left her to face the consequences of his cruelty alone. I cannot undo what he did, but I can at least ensure that the good work she's doing, in spite of what happened to her, can continue without financial worry." Over the following weeks, arrangements were made with the utmost discretion. Lord William's solicitors established a substantial trust fund for Mary's refuge, with the money to be distributed through a series of anonymous donations that would appear to come from various charitable sources. The refuge would never know that the Earl of Ashford was its primary benefactor, but Lord William wasn't finished. He also commissioned a private investigation into conditions at other great houses throughout England, documenting cases where servants had been mistreated or exploited by their employers. The findings were shocking. dozens of cases similar to Mary's, where powerful men had preyed upon vulnerable women with complete impunity. Using his position in the House of Lords, Lord William began quietly advocating for legal reforms that would provide better protections for domestic servants. He found allies among other progressive peers who had seen similar injustices, and together they began laying the groundwork for legislation that would, in future years, give servants legal recourse against abusive employers. It was Eleanor, however, who insisted on one final gesture that Lord William initially resisted. "She deserves to know the truth," Eleanor argued during one of their many discussions about Mary's situation. "She's been living for 20 years believing she's a murderer who escaped justice. Don't you think she deserves to know that at least one person in the Ashford family acknowledges what was done to her and doesn't condemn her for how she responded?" Lord William was torn. On one hand, he understood Eleanor's point. On the other, he worried that reopening old wounds might cause Mary more harm than good. What if telling her the truth destroys the peace she's found? He asked. What if it brings back all the trauma she spent 20 years trying to overcome? "Then we'll deal with those consequences together," Eleanor replied firmly. "But I have to believe, that truth and acknowledgement can be healing, even when they come late." In the end, Lord William agreed to let Eleanor write to Mary, with the understanding that the letter would be delivered through intermediaries and that Mary would have no obligation to respond. Eleanor spent days composing that letter, trying to find words adequate to express 20 years of regret, sorrow and pride in what Mary had accomplished despite everything. She explained Lord William's response to learning the truth, described the trust fund that had been established for the refuge, and most importantly, told Mary that she was not forgotten and that at least 2 people in the world understood why she had done what she did. The letter ended with these words: "My dear Mary, you have spent 20 years transforming your pain into purpose, your suffering into service to others. I want you to know that I am prouder of you than I could ever express in words. What happened to you was evil, and your response, while tragic, was understandable. You are not a monster, whatever you may have told yourself in the dark hours. You are a survivor who became a protector, and that is something truly remarkable. With all my love and deepest respect, Eleanor." 6 weeks passed with no response, and Eleanor began to fear that Mary had either not received the letter or had chosen not to acknowledge it. But then, on a crisp autumn morning, a reply arrived. Eleanor's hands shook as she broke the seal and began to read, "Dear Eleanor, I cannot describe what I felt when I received your letter. For 20 years, I have carried the weight of what I did, believing myself damned and deserving of that damnation. I convinced myself that I was a murderer, plain and simple, and that nothing I could do would ever balance the scales for having taken a human life. Your letter and Lord William's response to learning the truth has given me something I thought I had forfeited forever: the possibility of redemption. Not because what I did was right, it wasn't, but because someone finally acknowledged that I was a victim before I became a perpetrator, and that the circumstances that drove me to such a desperate act were themselves unjust. I will never forgive myself for killing Lord Thomas, even though I still believe the world is a better place without him in it. But I can at least stop defining myself solely by that one terrible moment, and instead focus on the hundreds of moments since. Then when I've been able to help other women avoid my fate, please tell Lord William that his generosity toward the refuge is beyond anything I could have hoped for or deserved. Tell him that his father's sins are not his to carry, and that I wish him every happiness in his coming marriage. And for you, my dear Eleanor, thank you. Thank you for protecting me 20 years ago when you could have exposed me. Thank you for keeping my secret even when the burden must have been crushing. And thank you for reaching out now to tell me that I am remembered with love rather than judgment. Yours always, Mary." Eleanor read the letter through tears. then read it again to Lord William, who sat in silence for a long time after she finished. "She deserves to be free of this burden entirely," he said finally. "I'm going to make one more arrangement. Within a month." Lord William had used his considerable influence to have the official cause of death on his father's death certificate quietly amended from heart failure to death by misadventure, following behavioral misconduct. It was vague enough not to specify what misconduct, but specific enough that anyone who investigated would understand that Lord Thomas had been at fault for whatever circumstances led to his death. More importantly, he had his solicitors draw up a document, to be kept sealed but accessible, that fully exonerated Mary Winters of any wrongdoing, describing the circumstances that had driven her to defend herself against an ongoing pattern of assault and the failure of all authorities to protect her. The document was backdated to 1844 and signed by Lord William in his capacity as the current Earl of Ashford and head of the family. "It's not a legal pardon," he explained to Eleanor. "I don't have the authority to grant one. But it's a formal acknowledgement from the Ashford family that Mary was a victim who acted in self-defense, and that she bears no moral guilt for what happened." He sealed the document and placed it in the family vault with instructions that it was to be preserved in perpetuity, so that if anyone ever questioned what happened to Lord Thomas or sought to prosecute Mary Winters, the truth would be available to defend her. On the day of Lord William's wedding to Lady Constance, Eleanor stood with the other servants, watching the celebrations, and felt a profound sense of peace. The house that had been poisoned by secrets and lies for 20 years was finally healing, and the young Earl who now led it was nothing like the man his father had been. Lady Constance, too, proved to be different from the previous Countess. One of her first acts as the new Lady Ashford was to establish clear policies protecting the household staff, including the right to report any misconduct without fear of dismissal and the right to request investigation into any complaints. "My husband has told me about certain incidents that occurred in this house in the past," she said during her first meeting with the household staff. "I want you all to know that such behavior will never be tolerated under my watch. Every person who works in Thornfield House deserves to be treated with dignity and respect, and I will personally ensure that this standard is maintained." Eleanor, watching the young Countess speak with such conviction, felt hope that perhaps the darkness of the past could finally be transformed into light for the future. 23 years after Mary Winters had fled Thornfield House, Eleanor received one final letter. Mary was dying of consumption, the letter explained, but she wanted Eleanor to know that she had lived a good life, despite its difficult beginning. The refuge would continue under new management after her death, and hundreds of women would continue to be helped by the institution she had built. "I have made my peace with what I did," Mary wrote. "I will not say it was right, but I can at least say that I spent the years I had afterward trying to ensure that no other woman would face what I faced. Tell Lord William that his kindness gave me a gift I never expected, the ability to think of the Ashford family without hatred. And tell him that I hope his marriage brings him all the joy that was denied to me. I die grateful to have known you and to have been loved by you. That love saved my life when I had lost all hope. Your devoted Mary." Eleanor was with Mary when she died a month later, holding the hand of the woman who had been like a daughter to her, and telling her that she was loved, that she was forgiven, and that her life had mattered in ways that stretched far beyond one terrible summer evening in 1844. At Mary's funeral, attended by hundreds of women whose lives she had touched, Eleanor looked around at the faces of those who had been saved by Mary's refuge and understood that sometimes redemption comes not from erasing the past, but from transforming its darkness into light for others. The maid who had poisoned an earl had indeed broken 20 years of silence. But what emerged from that breaking was not scandal or shame. It was truth, healing, and the profound understanding that justice sometimes wears unexpected faces. Thank you so much for following this powerful journey of truth, redemption, and the complexity of justice with us. If you've enjoyed this story, please don't forget to subscribe to our channel. We're so close to reaching 1,000 subscribers, and when we do, we have an absolutely amazing surprise planned for our community, something that will take your breath away. Hit that subscribe button and join our growing family of story lovers. You won't want to miss what we have in store.